Hey everyone, so this is a very simple homework video, nothing too complicated, but this is one of the first examples you do, for example, with N particles in Maya. So I decided I put it in as a very small example what you can do with grains. So by default, when you have a pop simulation and you emit a couple of points, this would happen. They would not fill this glass cup. So what we want to do in this example here is simply filling this cup with colliding particles. And this is something that shouldn't be too hard for you. So give it a try. There are just a few small things that you can do in different ways. So it's worth doing this as a little homework. And afterwards, I will show you how I did it in this particular case. And as usual, it's not about finding the exact same solution, but one solution that works. So see you in a bit. So what we start with, and the file that you can download, is basically just a simple pop simulation with this glass here. And this time I use a sphere that I turn into a volume. So when I use a pop emitter, which I use here, a pop source, then the points will be emitted inside of that volume. And this now looks like this. And as you can see, we have the problem, of course, that, with every pop simulation, the points are not colliding. So what we need here, of course, is a pop grain node that takes care of collisions between the points. And if we just, drop this in and press start, we will see, unfortunately, that nothing has changed. And the reason is that the pop grains needs a p-scale attribute. So there are many ways where you could do this. You can actually create this here on the outside, but I would do it inside with a pop wrangle, just to be sure that it works. This way I'm constantly overwriting the p-scale. So the p-scale, of course, is a float, and we just set it to a number that I tested, and that is 0025. You can play around what works for you, but this is just something that worked for me. You could also theoretically, instead of using the ISO offset to create a volume, you could have used a points from volume, which would have had the advantage that you can set the point separation yourself. And then with a jitter scale, you can have something where the point separation is clear. And then you can add this as a p-scale, and you would know the exact number that the points have as a distance. But we don't need it to be that perfect, because this should work now. So let's see, and we can see the points seem to collide. They seem to fill the whole thing here. But first of all, it's very hard to judge the whole thing without having spheres on it. So one way of doing this, and that's a very effective way if we're working with a lot of points, would be a pop sprite. And by default, it gets this weird smoke puff sprite, but instead we could use and we can choose it here in the texture folder and one up. And then if we know what we're looking for, it's the sphere matte. But since I know that I'm looking for that, and there it is, I can actually just type it in directly. So sphere matte dot pick. And if I change the frame, you can see now I have spheres. And now we can see a bit better the problem, and you can see it's very erratic. The points seem to collide, but they move around like crazy. Why is that? Well, of course, because we forgot the third thing, and that is increasing the substeps. In this case, because we have very few points or spheres, we can actually just use 10 and 10. I think that's fine. And this should be stable enough. And I think that's good enough. Feel free to increase it if you need a bit more stability or if you have way more points, but I think 10-10 is totally fine here. And you can see the whole thing instantly stabilizes. Now we're almost there, but the problem is that they are a bit boring. So let's add a little bit of color. We could do this afterwards. We could even do this here in the source if we wanted. But in this case, I want to use the pop color and want to change it to random. And actually the way it works right now is perfectly fine. Everything is as expected. Every point gets a different color based on the ID, by the way. So this is perfectly fine. And this is why I used it, because it's so easy and quick to do. Now there's one problem. I have a little bit of a light in my scene, but you can see it doesn't really apply to the spheres. And that's a bit of a downside of using those sprites here. So what I would do in this case, maybe, because it's not that many spheres, so we can get away with actual spheres here. Let's turn off the pop sprite and just use a classical copy to points at the end. And what we want to get out of the pop net is actually just the points. Currently, when we look at the points, you can see we actually get the ground and the glass as well. So either we do this, pop star in the output, or we could use a DOP import. In this case, I use a DOP import. So there's my network. I only want the pop points and I want to fetch them. And this is how it looks like. And when we rewind, you can see because we deleted the pop sprite, we only have the points themselves. So let's copy some spheres to it. And to save some geometry, I will this time use a primitive sphere. And the good thing is they already come with the correct p-scale that we assign to them. Somewhere here is a p-scale. Ah, there it is. And this means we can keep the sphere with a radius of 1. Unfortunately, we have to change it. But since it will be multiplied, the default sphere with 0.5 will be a little bit too small. So let's make sure the radius is actually 1, and then it takes the exact p-scale without adjusting it. And this means we can now use the lighting as well, which just looks a little bit nicer. And for shading, this could also be an advantage of not using sprites by geometry directly. Again, when you have a lot of points for sense simulation, for example, I would recommend maybe using sprites instead, but depending on what kind of look you want, copying spheres directly can be a solution. So that's great. Let's merge this together with the rest of our scene, in this case, just the glass. And unfortunately, the viewport in Houdini 19 is still not that great. So let's use a simpler version, something like that, and then it looks okay. So yeah, as you can see, many different ways of doing this. We use sprites, then we use spheres. And of course, by the way, we wouldn't necessarily have to use pop color if we don't want to. We could have done this afterwards by setting the color ourselves, of course, with a color node, for example, and then random per point, and we use random from attribute. And the attribute we want to use here is the ID, so that every point will get its own color. In this case, I think points are not dying in our shot, but ID is the safe bet if that's the case. So yeah, as you can see, not too complicated, just a little bit of, a practice to get used to the most important steps when using Grain. So I hope this is helpful. Thanks very much and see you later. Cheers.